The day I found out my sister had forged my mother's signature, I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I just made a cup of coffee, sat down at my kitchen table and started building a file. That's not the person I used to be, by the way. The old me would have called her immediately. Would have sobbed into the phone, demanded an explanation, probably begged her to just tell me it wasn't true. But I wasn't that person anymore. Funny what 3 years of being lied to will do to you. Let me back up. My name is Karen. I'm 44 years old. I'm a high school librarian from a mid-sized town in Ohio, and I have what you might call an unhealthy relationship with spreadsheets. I track my grocery spending. I track my mileage. I once built a 12-tab Excel workbook for a weekend camping trip. My coworkers think it's adorable. My therapist thinks it's a coping mechanism. She's probably right. I tell you this because it matters. It matters because the very thing my sister Diane always laughed at me for is the exact thing that unraveled her. Diane is 48. 4 years older than me, 4 inches taller, and for most of our lives 4 rungs above me on the family ladder. She's got that particular brand of confidence that comes from being the firstborn, the favorite, the one who gave our parents their first grandchild. She had a real estate license, a nice house in the suburbs of Columbus, and a smile that could make you feel like the most important person in the room. Right up until she needed something. And Diane, y'all. Diane always needed something. I want to paint you a picture of who she was before all of this, though. Because this isn't a story about a cartoon villain. I loved my sister. Actually loved her. We used to drive to Cracker Barrel on Sunday mornings when we were in our 20s, splitting one of those big biscuit plates, talking about our futures like they were these shining open highways. She was funny. God, she was funny. She did this impression of our Aunt Marlene that had me crying every single time. She remembered my birthday without being reminded. She showed up when my divorce went through and she sat on my couch for 6 hours and did not once make me feel pathetic. That's who I need you to hold in your mind, okay? That Diane. Because the Diane who comes later in this story didn't replace her overnight. She slid. Slowly. The way a picture frame goes crooked on a wall, so gradual you stop noticing until one day you walk in and the whole thing is sideways. The first loan was $700. This was about 6 years ago. Diane's youngest had a medical bill. Insurance was being difficult. Could I just spot her until the end of the month? Of course I could. I didn't even think twice. That's what sisters do. She paid me back too. 19 days later, cash in an envelope in my mailbox with a post-it note that said, "You're my person. Love you forever." I kept that note. I actually kept it. The second loan was $1,500. Then $3,000. Then, over the course of about 18 months, the amount started climbing in a way I kept finding reasons to explain away. The real estate market was rough. Her ex-husband was behind on support. Her car needed a new transmission. Every single story was plausible. Every single story came with eye contact and emotion and the particular vulnerability of someone who clearly hated asking. I never kept a running total. That was my mistake. I'm a librarian, I build spreadsheets for camping trips, and I never kept a running total of what I lent my own sister. You want to know why? Because it felt transactional. Because every time I thought about writing it down, some part of my brain said, "She's family, Karen, you don't do that to family." And Diane, God bless her, knew exactly which strings to pull. By the time my mother got sick, I had lent Diane somewhere in the neighborhood of $40,000. I didn't know that yet. I want to be clear. I didn't know. Mom's diagnosis came in February. Pancreatic. Stage 3, caught later than it should have been because Mom was the kind of woman who treated doctors like they were optional accessories. She was 71, stubborn as a fence post, and she lived alone in the house where Diane and I grew up, a 2-story colonial in Gahanna with a screened-in porch she'd filled with so many plants it looked like a greenhouse had a baby with a living room. The next 11 months were the kind of time you don't really live through, you survive through. Diane handled most of the medical coordination because she lived closer, and I drove up every other weekend, sat with Mom, helped her with her crosswords, watched old episodes of Jeopardy! That she'd already seen twice but still shouted answers at. We were a family doing what families do when they know time is running short. We were loving each other loudly, because we knew the quiet was coming. Mom passed on a Thursday in January. Peaceful at home, exactly how she wanted. I'm not going to spend too long here because this isn't a story about grief. It's a story about what came after the grief. But I need you to understand that the ground was already unsteady when Diane started making her next move. I was standing in quicksand and I didn't feel it because I was too busy missing my mother. The will was read about 3 weeks after the funeral. I drove up to Columbus, met with Mom's attorney, a quiet man named Gerald who'd been handling our family's affairs since before I was born, and sat in his little office that smelled like old paper and lemon furniture polish. Diane was across the table from me, wearing a black blazer, looking appropriately solemn. The estate was modest. The house, some savings, a small investment account that Mom had quietly built over 30 years of careful spending. Total value, roughly $360,000. Gerald read the will. Mom had split it equally. Half to Diane, half to me. I remember feeling this rush of something I'm almost ashamed of. Not greed. Something more like relief. Because I was looking at a number that would clear my credit card debt, fix my leaky roof, and let me breathe for the first time in years. $180,000. That's what it felt like. Like oxygen. Diane squeezed my hand across the table. She took care of us, she said. I nodded. I cried a little. Gerald handed me a tissue. And then nothing happened. I mean, probate takes time, I understood that. Gerald told us it could be several months. But 3 months became 5 and 5 became 8, and every time I called his office there was some new explanation. A lien issue. A title discrepancy. Documentation from the state. I'm not an estate attorney, so I took it at face value and I waited. Diane always seemed to know slightly more than me about the status. She lived closer to Gerald's office, she said. She'd stopped in a couple times. Made sense. Ain't gonna lie to you. I knew something was wrong. I knew in the way you know a storm is coming before the sky changes, just a feeling in the air, a frequency shift. Something in Diane's voice when I brought it up. Something slightly too smooth, slightly too prepared. But I kept talking myself out of it. This is your sister. This is your person. This is the woman who sat on your couch for 6 hours after your divorce. The thing that finally cracked it open wasn't dramatic. It wasn't some cinematic moment of confrontation. It was a phone call from Gerald's office, and not to me. To Mom's neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, a 73-year-old retired schoolteacher who had been my mother's closest friend for 22 years, and who called me out of the blue on a random Tuesday afternoon. Karen, she said, and she sounded confused in the way older people do when they're trying to sort out if they've made a mistake. Did you know Gerald needs to speak with witnesses about the amended will? He called me last week. He had questions about when your mother... I called a probate attorney. Not Gerald, someone new, someone Diane had no connection to. A woman named Priya, recommended by a colleague, who had the kind of quiet competence that reminded me of a surgeon who doesn't need to announce they're good at their job because the results speak for themselves. I told Priya everything. I laid out the file I'd built, the timeline, the witness names, the documentation I'd found. I slid a folder across her desk and watched her read it. She didn't react dramatically. She just read, occasionally made a small note, asked me 2 questions for clarification. Then she set the folder down and looked at me. You've done good work, she said. I'm a librarian, I said. She almost smiled. We're going to need a handwriting expert. We're going to need statements from the witnesses. And we're going to need to understand the full flow of assets from the time the amended document was filed. She paused. This is going to take a few months. Can you hold on for a few months? I've been holding on for 3 years, I said. Here's where it gets interesting. Because this is the part of the story where most people would expect the quiet build-up, the gathering of evidence, the patient waiting. And yes, that happened. But something else happened too. Something I didn't plan and didn't expect. And that turned out to be the most important piece of the whole puzzle. I started spending time with Diane. I know how that sounds. But hear me out. Priya had been very clear with me. Do not let Diane know you know. Do not change your behavior in any way that might tip her off. Act normal. Which meant Sunday phone calls, the occasional weekend visit, sitting across from my sister at holiday tables and watching her laugh and pour wine and be the exact same person she'd always been on the surface. I want to tell you that was torture. It was some of the time. There were moments when she'd make some comment about how long probate was taking, how complicated these things get, how exhausting it was to handle all of this. And I'd feel that live wire again crackling in my chest, and I'd have to take a breath and remind myself, not yet. Not yet. But other times, Other times it was something different, because I was watching Diane now in a way I'd never watched her before. Not as her sister, but as a researcher. And when you watch someone that carefully, you start to see the seams, little things. The way she pivoted away from any specific question about the estate timeline. The way she'd say Gerald says before I'd even asked. The way her hands never quite settled when the subject came up. She'd reach for her wine or tuck her hair or glance at her phone. And the loans. My God, the loans. Now that I was really looking, I could see money moving through her life in a pattern. A new car, 8 months after Mom's diagnosis. A kitchen renovation she showed me on Instagram with the caption, "Treating myself." A girls' weekend to Nashville that she mentioned casually, like it was nothing. I started building the second spreadsheet. I went back through every text message, every Venmo notification, every memory I had of money moving between us, and I reconstructed as much of the loan history as I could. $41,200. That's what I came to, give or take. 4.5 years of "could you just spot me?" Of post-it notes with "you're my person." Of borrowing from a sister who trusted her because sisters don't do that to sisters. I want to tell you something true, and it's something I've thought about a lot since all of this ended. I think Diane loved me. Genuinely. I think the part of her that drove to my house after my divorce and sat with me for 6 hours was real. I also think there's a particular kind of person who can hold love and exploitation in the same hand, who can mean both things simultaneously, who can cry real tears over the person they're stealing from. That's not a contradiction. That's just a more unsettling kind of broken than we usually talk about. 3 months into this process, Priya called me with news. The handwriting expert had issued her preliminary opinion. The signatures on the amended will were inconsistent with known samples of my mother's handwriting. Not definitively forged, that determination would take longer, but in her professional assessment, highly irregular. The witness in Phoenix, a woman named Sandra, had given a notarized statement saying she'd had no contact with our family in over 2 years and had not signed any document related to my mother's estate. Diane's college roommate, a woman named Tony, had been harder to reach, but Priya's investigator had finally found her, and Tony's response when shown the document with her name on it was, and Priya read this to me verbatim, "What in the hell is this?" It was real. All of it. The thing I'd suspected, the thing I'd been building toward, the thing that some part of me had still hoped might be a misunderstanding, it was real. I sat in my car in the parking lot of a Target on a Wednesday afternoon, and I cried for 20 minutes. Not the gasping, ugly kind. The quiet kind where your face just leaks and you don't bother to stop it. I was crying for my mom. For the version of things that could have been. For Sunday mornings at Cracker Barrel and post-it notes that said "you're my person." And then I wiped my face, drove home and called Priya back to talk about next steps. The trap. And I know that sounds calculated, but I'm going to own it. The trap came together because of Diane's own impatience. 8 months after Mrs. Patterson's phone call, Diane started pushing. The probate was dragging, she said. Gerald needed to move faster. She called me twice in 1 week to complain about it, which was unusual. And then she did something that, in retrospect, I think was panic wearing the costume of frustration. She suggested we both call Gerald together. A conference call. Get him to give us a real update, she said. As a united front. Now I want you to think about what that meant. Diane was pushing for a direct conversation with the attorney who was sitting on documentation she had filed. Either she didn't know that Priya had already been in contact with Gerald's office, which was possible, or she was trying to control the narrative before things moved further. Either way, she wanted to be in the room. I said yes. Of course I said yes. Called Priya first. She said 3 words. Perfect. Let it happen. The call was set for a Thursday morning, 10 o'clock. I was in my home office, door closed, coffee going. Diane dialed in from her house. Gerald was on from his office. Pleasantries were exchanged. And then Diane organized, prepared, the picture of a grieving daughter just trying to settle her mother's affairs. Started asking about the timeline for distribution under the amended will. Gerald paused. It was a very specific kind of pause. The pause of a man who had been quietly informed by a second attorney that there were questions about the document in question, and who had agreed, carefully, professionally, to let the conversation develop naturally. There have been some inquiries, Gerald said slowly, related to the amendment. Some questions have come up that we need to resolve before we can move to distribution. Diane's voice changed. Barely. You'd have to know her to hear it. A slight tightening like a rubber band pulled one notch too far. What kind of questions? Verification of the execution of the document, Gerald said. The witnesses. Silence. I did not say anything. I sat in my office with my coffee cooling in my hand and I waited. I'm sure that's all routine, Diane said. She laughed a little. That particular laugh she had, the one that performed ease. Sandra and Tony both signed. I was there. And there it was. You understand what just happened, right? Diane had just placed herself at the signing. She had, without being asked, volunteered that she was present when those two women supposedly witnessed our mother's signature. Sandra, who'd been in Phoenix. Tony, who'd never seen the document. Diane had handed Priya, and eventually a probate court, exactly the thread they needed. I heard Gerald shuffle some papers. I see, he said. I set down my coffee cup very carefully, because my hands had started shaking. The legal process that followed is not particularly dramatic to describe. Probate disputes don't look like courtroom scenes from TV. They look like document submissions and motions in waiting rooms with bad chairs. But the outcome was real. The amended will was challenged. The handwriting expert's findings were entered into evidence. Sandra's statement. Tony's statement. Diane's own words on a recorded conference call, placing herself at a signing that neither witness could confirm. Diane got an attorney. A good one. She denied everything, claimed she'd witnessed the signing herself, that her recollection of the event was accurate, that the women must be misremembering. She called me 3 times. The first call I let go to voicemail. The second call I answered, said I had nothing to say until things were resolved legally, and hung up. The third call, she cried. I want to be honest with you about that call, because I think there's a version of this story where I describe that moment and I sound triumphant and unaffected, and I don't want to lie to you. Hearing my sister cry, the real kind, not the performed kind, and yes, by then I could tell the difference, was one of the hardest things I've ever sat through. I held the phone and I listened, and some ancient cellular part of me wanted to say, it's okay, we'll figure this out, you're still my person. But my mother signed nothing. My mother, who grew those plants on her porch like they were her children, who shouted at Jeopardy! Reruns, who took care of us her entire life and who deserved to decide, in her own handwriting, what happened to what she'd built. My mother's name had been used without her knowledge, while she was scared and sick and dying. That was the wall I kept coming back to. Every time the grief tried to make me soften. The amended will was invalidated. The original will stood. My share of the estate was restored. The matter of the loans, $41,200, was addressed as part of a separate civil filing that Priya handled with the same quiet competence she brought to everything. Diane did not go to jail. I want to be clear about that because I know that's what some of you are waiting to hear, and the truth is messier than that. The DA's office reviewed the case. Ultimately, the determination was that proving criminal intent beyond a reasonable doubt, given the complexity of the documentation and Diane's insistence on her version of events, was not a path they wanted to pursue. It happens. The civil findings stood. She had to repay the loans through a structured arrangement that will take her years. She lost her real estate license. A separate consequence that came from the estate fraud finding being reported to the licensing board. She lost her house eventually. Couldn't sustain the payments once the financial structure she'd been maintaining started to collapse. I found out through a cousin, not directly from Diane. I didn't reach out when I heard. I've been asked if I feel guilty about that, about not reaching out. And the honest answer is, some days a little. Some days I drive past a Cracker Barrel and I think about biscuits and open highways and a woman who could do an impression of our Aunt Marlene that had me crying every time, and I feel something complicated and heavy and without a clean name. But my mother's handwriting was on a document she never signed, and I built a file, and I waited. And I think if she were here, if my mom were on her screened-in porch with her plants watching her Jeopardy! Stubborn as a fence post, I think she'd say, you did right, Karen. I keep that thought the way I once kept a post-it note. Carefully. In a place I know won't go sideways. There is one more thing. The final thing. The detail I didn't tell Priya until after the case was fully resolved, because I didn't want it to complicate anything legally, and also because it was mine. Just mine. About 2 weeks before the conference call with Gerald, I'd been going through a box of Mom's things. Old photos, letters, the usual bittersweet archaeology of a parent's life. And at the bottom of the box, under a birthday card I'd made her in 2nd grade and a photograph of her and Dad at Niagara Falls, I found a letter. It was addressed to me, in my mother's handwriting, unmistakably hers, all the loops and the slightly crooked capital K she always made. It wasn't dated, but from the context, I'm certain she wrote it sometime in the fall before she died. I'm not going to read you the whole letter. Some of it is too private. But there is one line I want to share with you because it is the line that lives in me now, the one I go back to when the complicated feelings get loud. She wrote, "I don't know exactly what's been happening, baby, but I know something's not right. You've always been the one who notices. Trust that." She knew. Not everything, but something. She knew the way mothers know things they can't entirely see. And she told me to trust myself. I folded that letter up and I put it in the file. Right at the front. That's where it still is. I think about Diane. Not every day anymore, but sometimes. I think about the way people slide. The way love and need and entitlement can get so tangled together you can't find the thread that leads back to basic decency. I think about how she probably told herself a story, a whole coherent, justified story, about why what she was doing was okay, or at least understandable, or at least survivable. People are good at that. We're all good at that, to one degree or another. The difference is just the thing we're justifying. I fixed my leaky roof. I paid off my credit cards. I took 2 weeks off in September and drove to Maine, which was something I'd wanted to do since I was 32 years old and kept putting off for reasons I now understand had more to do with financial anxiety than anything else. I ate lobster on a dock in Rockport while the fog came in off the water, and I thought about my mother, and I did not cry. I just sat with her the way you can sit with someone you've lost, not talking, just present. The spreadsheet is still on my laptop. I look at it sometimes. Not out of anger. More like looking at a scar. Curious about the shape of it, a little amazed by what healed. My therapist says I've developed, and I'm quoting here, an impressive capacity for delayed action. She doesn't entirely mean it as a compliment. We're working on that. But here's what I know for certain, standing on this side of it. The truth doesn't need you to be loud. It doesn't need you to be the angriest person in the room. Sometimes it just needs you to be the most organized one. And sometimes it needs you to sit across from your sister at a holiday table. Watch her refill everyone's wine, laugh at the right moments, be exactly who she's always been to the people who love her. While you quietly, patiently, meticulously build a file that tells the real story. I'm Karen. I'm a librarian from Ohio. I have an unhealthy relationship with spreadsheets. And I am the best enemy my sister ever made. If you've ever sat across from someone at a family table and smiled while your stomach turned over, drop it in the comments. I want to know how you held on. And if this story stayed with you, subscribe, because next week I'm going to tell you about the second box of my mother's things and what I found at the very bottom of it. That one, I'm still not sure I'm ready to say out loud.